Tonight we'll hear from culinary historians on how Boston and Cambridge have changed the American diet. This is the second program in a 6-program series. Some of our upcoming programs include on May 3rd, Where to Go, which will look at famous restaurants of the past. May 18th, which is Sweet Boston, which will explore Boston's sort of unusual obsession with candy and sweets. June 6th, the Ice Kings, exploring this area's obsessive interest in ice cream. And on June 15th, Final Courses, which will be a walking tour of the final resting places of some of Boston's greatest culinary innovators at Mount Auburn Cemetery. So I hope that you'll be able to join us for some or all of those. Tonight we'll explore the role Boston played in widening the American palate by introducing new foods to the public. Most famously, this was done by 2 celebrity chefs, Joyce Chen and Julia Child, both of whom had nationally syndicated PBS cooking shows based in Boston, and both of whom lived in Cambridge, which I have to point out because I'm from Cambridge. So I think it's an exciting subject. The program tonight will be moderated by Megan Sniffin-Marinoff, who will introduce the other speakers. Megan is well known to many in the library community. In 2004, she became the Harvard University archivist, shifting from being the library and deputy director of Radcliffe Schlesinger Library, which of course has one of the largest collections of culinary history in the world, including Julia Child's papers. Prior to working at Radcliffe, she had been the head of the Institute Archives and Special Collections at MIT and the archives of Simmons College. So she's certainly well known within the academic library community. So without further ado, I'll turn it over to Megan and she can introduce the rest of the...
Thank you, Gavin. Well, I think we're in for a really great treat tonight. Our speakers, who I'll introduce shortly, will be enlarging our understanding of some of the changing attitudes and practices of what has been termed for this program, eating other people's food. Each has about 12.5 minutes to speak to summarize their research and their interests. And at the end, we're going to give them a moment to raise questions among themselves before we turn it over to the audience. So if you can please just try to hold your questions to the end, that would be terrific. Laura Shapiro, at the far end, has been giving a lot of thought to our preconceptions about how the changing American attitudes towards food in the second half of the 20th century evolved. Laura was a columnist at The Real paper in Boston, and I know that some of you remember it, before beginning a 16-year run at Newsweek, where she covered food, women's issues, and the arts, and won several journalism awards. Her essays, reviews, and features have also appeared in The New Yorker, The New York Times, Condé Nast Traveler, Gourmet, Gastronomica, Slate, and many other publications. Her first book was Perfection Salad, Women in Cooking at the Turn of the Century, which the University of California Press has reissued with a new afterword. She is also the author of Something from the Oven, Reinventing Dinner in 1950s America, and Julia Child, which won the award for literary food writing from the International Association of Culinary Professionals. Her work is represented in the Library of America's American Food Writing and the Virago Book of Food. She's a frequent speaker and panelist on culinary history and contributed a regular column on a wide range of food topics to gourmet.com, the gourmet magazine website. During 2009 to 10, she was a fellow at the Cullman Center for Scholars and Writers at the New York Public Library. More recently, she was co-curator for Lunch Hour New York City, an acclaimed exhibition at the New York Public Library documenting the mingled histories of New York City and the American midday meal. Her latest book, What She Ate, 6 Remarkable Women and the Food That Tells Their Stories, will be published in July 2017. Alex Prud'homme and Stephen Chen will be providing perspectives on 2 of the most well-known purveyors of change on the Boston food scene, changes that went well beyond Boston and Cambridge. Julia Child, through her publications and from a perch at WGBH, brought fine dining into American living rooms. Joyce Chen and her fascinating life story was convincing Bostonians that they could both eat and cook Mandarin cuisine. In the 1960s, Julia Child and Joyce Chen brought the flavors of the world to America through Boston. Alex Prud'homme has been a nonfiction writer for 30 years. He has covered a wide range of subjects from biotech to terrorism, environmental issues, art, business, monster trucks, and food, for the New York Times, The New Yorker, Vanity Fair, and Time, among other publications. He has written 6 books, most notably as the co-author of Julia Child's memoir, My Life in France, which was a #1 New York Times bestseller and inspired half the film, Julie and Julia. His book, The Ripple Effect, The Fate of Fresh Water in the 21st Century, was published by Scribner in 2011 and inspired Participant Media's 2012 documentary film, Last Call at the Oasis. A year later, he produced Hydrofracking, What Everyone Needs to Know for Oxford University Press. Prud'homme's book, The French Chef in America, Julia Child's Second Act, explains how Julia left the French chef behind and found her true voice in the 1970s. In October, Thames and Hudson will publish Our Lives in France, Paul and Julia Child's photographic journey. Alex also wrote the text about his granduncle, Paul Child, for that book. His latest book is A Culinary History of the White House, from George Washington to Donald Trump. Stephen Chen is the youngest son of Joyce Chen. In 1958, Stephen's family brought Stephen, age 6 years old, to a large building in Cambridge which contained tall shelves to climb on and a large room of chairs and tables to run around and play hide and seek. He remembers being upset that he did not know it was going to be the new family restaurant. This was the beginning of a life that involved assisting with his mother's many ventures, including several restaurants, a cookbook, a PBS cooking show, cooking classes, and eventually developing the Joyce Chen cookware and food companies. He accompanied his mother and sister, Helen, on an around-the-world trip in 1968 for 3 months, experiencing foods from many cultures throughout Europe and Asia, which inspired new recipes and ideas for the businesses. In 1972, soon after Nixon made his historic visit to China, Stephen, who was then 20, traveled to China with his family and filmed a documentary, which was then broadcast nationally on PBS as a documentary special of the week. Stephen helped run Joyce's restaurants and businesses throughout her illness with Alzheimer's and until her death in 1994. Currently, he lives in Acton with his wife and 3 rescue dogs and is looking forward to attending his daughter's graduation from Florida State University's computer engineering program this May. He owns and operates the Joyce Chen Foods Company, which markets frozen Peking ravioli, sauces, and condiments in grocery stores throughout the United States. So this is our lineup for the evening, and we're going to start right away with Laura.
Thank you. I think we can all agree that the 1950s has become the most widely reviled decade in American culinary history. Most people sum it up as a time when Americans were wandering lost and helpless in a desert of canned soup, casseroles, and marshmallow salads, until Julia came along and led us into a glorious new world. There is some truth to that picture. Julia had an enormous impact, which we'll be hearing about from Alex. But there is also something that I think people forget about Julia's arrival on the scene. Her success was immediate. American women were supposed to be terrified of fancy French cooking, but they pounced on Julia's recipes. You would have thought there was an entire nation of home cooks standing around impatiently tapping their feet until someone finally came along who could teach them how to make veal Prince Orloff. Obviously, Julia herself, one of the most charismatic television figures in the history of television, had a lot to do with that. But more was going on. Throughout the 1950s, the culinary stage was being set. People's appetites were being primed. Their minds were opening. In other words, a food revolution was gearing up long before the unique phenomenon known as Julia landed in the American kitchen. Food revolutions start with money, and there was money around in post-war America. Millions of people were moving into the middle class. Millions more had reason to dream that it was possible. From 1950 to 1960, the number of homeowners nearly quadrupled, which meant, first of all, that people had new kitchens to set up, and second, just as important, they had new lives to set up. So here you are, a 1950s homemaker living in a new suburb. You've got an electric stove, a refrigerator with a freezing compartment. You've got a blender. You've got a wooden salad bowl that apparently you're not supposed to wash. Now, what are you going to cook? Maybe you pick up a copy of Woman's Day, which is easy to do because it's on sale in every supermarket in the country right at the checkout counter. In Woman's Day, you'll find directions for making homemade soup using 2 cans of soup and a cup of Velveeta. You will also find directions for making blintzes from scratch, pizza from scratch, and a Chinese-style chicken dish that calls for bamboo shoots, water chestnuts, dried mushrooms, and fresh bok choy. Or maybe you're looking in Good Housekeeping, which you, your mother, and your grandmother have been reading all your lives. Good Housekeeping is describing how to serve prosciutto with fresh melon as an appetizer. They're running recipes for quiche Lorraine and for guacamole. Or maybe you've got a few of these wonderful Mrs. Appleyard cookbooks around, published by Houghton Mifflin right here in Boston, written by Louise Andrews Kent, who lived right around the corner in Brookline. She was offering classic New England recipes for corn pudding and baked beans, and recipes for gazpacho and paella and madeleines. The point is, you did not have to go very far afield to encounter new possibilities for home cooking in the 50s. There were plenty of good recipes around, close to home and accessible. Now, of course, comes the real question. Was anybody picking up on these new ideas? Or was everybody flipping right past these recipes and going on to make tuna casserole with potato chips on top and under the sea salad with green jello? Here we get to a problem that has plagued culinary historians since the invention of culinary history. How do we know what ordinary women made for dinner on an ordinary Wednesday night in, say, 1956? If she's truly ordinary, she didn't leave a diary or a stash of letters or a file of her grocery receipts. Of course, we can find out how much beef Americans consumed in 1956, and we can find out how many cans of peas were sold that year. That is something. To me personally, it's nothing. I want to know what was on the table on the plates, which is why when I'm thinking about the 50s, and especially when I'm thinking about the 50s in Boston, I fanatically read back issues of the Boston Globe, because the Globe had the confidential chat. I am sure many of you know the chat. It ran regularly in the women's pages of the Globe for more than a century. Women wrote to the chat with all sorts of questions, and other women wrote in with answers, and everyone used pen names so they could be sure of privacy. Every conceivable problem that could arise in a woman's life made it into those pages, but many, many questions were about homemaking, and huge numbers were about cooking. So to look at a swath of chat letters over the years is to get a rare glimpse of what was on the minds of real, live, ordinary women when they thought about feeding their families. They always start with the name of the person that they're writing to or whose question they're addressing. Thistle, I saw your letter to Stonehenge about sweet and sour pork and thought you might like this recipe. To us, it tastes just like the kind served in Chinese restaurants. Incidentally, I share your opinion of daylight savings time. Signed, Roe. Rosalind, would you by any chance have a recipe for bagels? I would appreciate it so very much, as we love hot bagels. Signed, Biney. Sisters, has anyone instructions on how to prepare, quote, tenderloin tips in mushroom gravy, unquote? I recently enjoyed this at a restaurant and would love to learn how to make it at home. The meat was a little red in the center and extremely tender, and there was only a delicate flavor of the mushrooms. Signed, A Ghost and Roosters. Sisters, anyone know how to cook a dish called shrimp scampi? It is shrimp sauteed in garlic butter. Signed, Pinch and Pennies. Sisters, I would like to join the chat and ask you immediately for help in finding recipes from the Middle East. Several weeks ago, I was very happy to find the recipe for baklava. Any other ideas and recipes to tempt an Egyptian gentleman's palate would be gratefully received. Signed, Egyptian's Gal. Most of all, and this is very striking in these pages, the chatters wanted to talk about dessert. They wrote constantly back and forth about sweets and especially baking. And if you look at community cookbooks, for instance, the other great source for what ordinary people were cooking, the recipe section is always dozens and dozens of pages long. The main dishes are maybe like that, salads are like that. The desserts go on forever. And that was definitely true in the chat. Sisters, anyone have a recipe for devil dogs, the chocolatey things with a cream filling? Signed, Just Wondering. Sisters, I would like a good strudel with fillings such as apple or something similar. I never seem able to make a good dough and feel terrible about it because my family loves strudel. Signed, Looking Forward. And here is one that jumped out at me. Fireman's Wife Over these many years, I have been an admirer of you and your culinary art and good sense. Do you have a recipe for a small-sized chocolate cake? I cannot dispose of a large one unless I feed the neighbors. A mix is on the market, which even has a tinfoil pan, but I do not like mixes and much prefer to bake my own, signed The Day Before. Well, the mix that The Day Before is referring to was put out by Betty Crocker, who of course had many mixes on the market in the 50s, but this one was unusual. It was called Answer Cake, and according to the ads, it was the answer to all those home cooks who wanted to make smaller cakes and were clamoring for a mix that would do just that. Clearly, Betty Crocker, that is General Mills, had done some research. There were women who wanted to be able to bake a smaller than usual cake, but they weren't necessarily looking for a mix. In fact, cake mixes were a tough sell in the 50s. Women did not go for them at first. A cake was a powerful symbol of love, home, femininity. It was something that came from the heart. If it was going to count, you made it with your own two hands. And that's what this chatter is saying. She said, even though it came with this lovely little tinfoil pan, forget it, I want the real thing. So you see this all through the chat, this yen to cook by hand. It's not that these women were ignoring or disdaining packaged foods. They show up all the time, but they don't always take center stage. These chat sisters did not spend all their time making things like shrimp scampi and homemade bagels, far from it. They were most often making things like American chop suey and cream chipped beef and chicken a la king. But they had a hands-on sensibility that comes out loud and clear. Now, obviously, for research purposes, this is a very self-selected group of home cooks. They were very interested in cooking, so interested that they wrote to the chat about it. But that is the foundation for a food revolution. They cared, they were curious, and they loved being part of an active exchange of ideas. Throughout the 1950s, the food industry was mounting an all-out war on women like the chatters, trying to convert them to everything ready-made, everything quick and easy, everything heat and eat. And throughout the 1950s, many of these women resisted. They kept cooking. When they met Julia, they were ready for her. Thank you.
Thanks, Laura. That was the perfect setup. Laura was talking about the 50s, and I'll talk about the 60s and 70s. So from her base here in Boston, Julia Child spent much of her career introducing us to other people's food, which is the topic today. First French and later foods of the world. And while meanwhile tracing the evolution of American cooking and her own family's culinary history. Now, Julia's life experience made her ideally suited to the role of cultural interpreter or translator. I like to think of her as a culinary diplomat. She understood her audience's questions, fears, and prejudices because they had once been her own. When she first arrived in Paris in 1948, Julia considered herself a too tall, too loud, rather unsophisticated social butterfly who could barely boil water. But she and Paul, her husband, lived abroad for many years in Sri Lanka and China during the Second World War, and then in France, Germany, and Norway as diplomats after the war. By the time she returned here to the States and settled in Boston, she had evolved into a sophisticated and worldly woman, an accomplished French cook, and a writer and teacher. By then, Julia had answers, opinions, and encouragement to offer her fellow Americans. Now, the Childs retired from the Foreign Service in May of 1961, and they chose to settle here in Cambridge rather than in Washington or Los Angeles or New York for a number of reasons. First off, Paul had spent much of his youth here in and around Boston, and Julia's family was rooted in Western Massachusetts, and she always liked to mention her New England Yankee roots. Cambridge is intimate enough to provide a community, and it's just across the Charles from the city here. But best of all, to Julia, it was populated by eggheads, intellectuals from widely varied backgrounds who taught at Harvard or MIT or BU, or who were architects, historians, economists, and artists. In other words, these were her kind of people. And for Julia, she was all about the people. With the help of her friend Avis Devoto, the Childs bought a large gray clapboard Victorian house at 103 Irving Street, a leafy lane behind the Harvard campus, and settled into what they thought would be a quiet life. Julia would write and teach cookery, as she liked to say. Paul would paint and take photographs. But fate had other ideas. In October of 1961, Julia published her first cookbook, Mastering the Art of French Cooking. It got a rave review from Craig Claiborne in the New York Times and helped to catalyze the American food revolution, which was just getting underway. Julia was a natural communicator, and in the 1960s, she made French food accessible to the American public and taught us how to make cooking make sense, as she put it. Though she didn't know it, her message was on point and her timing was impeccable. America was ready for Julia and her brand of cookery-bookery, as she called it. After years of scrimping through the breadlines of the Depression and subsisting on basics during the war, Americans craved something more, to open their senses, luxuriate in taste, and experiment with new ingredients and exotic flavors after the war. In the meantime, Gourmet magazine had launched in 1941. In that same year, Henri Soulet and Pierre Freny opened Le Pavillon, a temple of haute cuisine and a training ground for many chefs in New York. In 1947, Pan Am introduced affordable transatlantic flights. And as Americans traveled and tasted new foods, they wanted to replicate them at home. By 1960, nearly 2/3 of American families owned a television set. With millions of people watching the same shows at the same time, a virtual community was born. TV was a new kind of hearth, or a window on the world, as they called it. We were entranced by the blend of sitcoms, sports, space travel, racial protests, and the Vietnam War, flickering in our living rooms every night. Now, many people assume that Julia was the first TV chef, but in fact, people had been cooking on television since the 40s. In 1946, for example, James Beard had a show on NBC called I Love to Eat, which was aptly titled, if you ever knew what he looked like. There were dozens of local programs all across the country, like Mary Wilson's Pots, Pans, and Personalities, Marjorie Hume's What's Cookin', the opera-singing Italian chef Pino Bontempi, and, my favorite, the blind Mexican cook Elena Zellieta in the 1950s. By 1962, the Kennedys had hired the French chef René Verdon to cook in the White House, which seemed the height of sophistication. Yet many of us were subsisting on instant soup mixes, spaghetti in a can, iceberg lettuce, and Jell-O with marshmallows. It was against this backdrop that Julia appeared on a local TV program called I've Been Reading on WGBH in 1962. She was supposed to discuss her book, Mastering the Art of French Cooking, but being Julia, she didn't just bring the book, she also brought a hot plate and a frying pan and a dozen eggs and a lot of butter, and proceeded to demonstrate the making of a French omelet. And in fact, she was so intent on that demonstration that she forgot to mention the title of her book. But the good news was that all 27 people who saw the show that night wrote in to GBH and said, "We want more of that tall lady cooking." Thus encouraged, Julia made 3 pilots or test shows. Each one went better than the last, and in February of 1963, Julia made her debut as the French chef, demonstrating how to make a boeuf bourguignon, which sounded terribly intimidating until she explained that it's just plain old beef stew. And she reassured her viewers that if she could make it, anyone could. So with this book and TV show, Julia launched her career as a culinary diplomat. But she wasn't a steely-eyed negotiator with a top hat on. Julia was a fresh-faced, 50-year-old, somewhat discombobulated enthusiast who dressed in pearls, a blue apron, and size 12 sneakers. Almost immediately, she grabbed people's attention with her winning combination of well-honed skills, deep knowledge, breezy unpredictability, and loopy humor. She'd grumble that potatoes are neurotic vegetables. She'd smooshed together a collapsing dessert with her long fingers, saying, "It tastes better that way." And she even brushed the teeth of a roast suckling pig. There was simply no one else doing this on television, and no one able to translate other people's food with such natural charm. Even people who didn't like to cook would tune in to see what Mrs. Child would do next, which she often didn't know herself. But there was an underlying seriousness and a sense of activism to her performance. When Julia exhorted us to demand that our supermarkets carry fresh mushrooms and garlic presses, the stores complied because they would instantly sell out on those items. Julia explained the method to her madness this way. She said, "The idea was to take the bugaboo out of French cooking, to demonstrate that it's not merely good cooking, but that it follows definite rules. One of the secrets of cooking is to learn to correct something if you can, and bear with it if you cannot." There was something intimate and subverbal, even primal, about the experience of watching Julia cook. She was having so much sensual fun, and her food was so lovingly portrayed that there are moments, even now, when it transports you. The audience responded viscerally. "You are a delight," wrote housewives, hippies, taxi drivers, MIT scientists, and Wall Street bankers. The New York Times wrote, "The French Chef was educational TV's answer to underground movie and pop-up cults. The program can be campier than Batman, further out than Lost in Space, and more penetrating than Meet the Press, as it probes the question, can a society be great if its bread tastes like Kleenex?" Now, Julia performed as the French chef for about a decade, but that was only a quarter of her career. In the 1970s, she transformed herself once again, and became Julia Child. By that point, the food revolution was in full swing, and Americans were experimenting with cooking from all over the world. Not only French and Italian, but Chinese, Japanese, Brazilian, Mexican, and Greek. In 1970 to 71, season 2 of The French Chef aired with great fanfare. It had more episodes, was shot in color for the first time, and included some short documentary films about classical French foodways. But it met a kind of tepid response from the public, and Julia faced an existential crisis. It seemed that the forces that she had helped to unleash were now making her irrelevant. So what did she do? Well, she decided to head in a new direction. Eager to burst out of the straitjacket of classical French cuisine, Julia split with her French collaborator, Simca Beck, stopped performing as the French chef, rebranded herself as Julia, and began to use recipes from around the world. I think of this as Julia's second act, the time when she finally discovered her true voice. And in 1975, she wrote a new kind of book. It was called From Julia Child's Kitchen, and it was written in the first person, which she'd never done before. It was illustrated with personal anecdotes and stuffed with recipes from all over the place: Scottish broth, Belgian cookies, Italian pastas, and a few of her own concoctions, such as Mrs. Child's famous sticky fruitcake, which was neither famous nor sticky, but was, I can tell you, delicious. Now, she noted that people can be tribal and chauvinistic about regional dishes, but many popular foods are, in fact, cultural hybrids. Consider Caesar salad, which was invented by an Italian chef living in Mexico for American tourists. Or Indian curries, which were not Indian at all, but were invented for the British and, Julia says, involved Yankee ingenuity and French know-how. They were an illustration of how we can have fun in the exotic food section of the supermarket. Julia even promoted space-age cookware such as the pressure cooker, the electric super blender, aka the Cuisinart, and her favorite, the microwave oven. Yet even as Julia was looking outward, she was also turning inward. Living here in Cambridge, she was re-Americanizing herself and reacquainting herself with our American culinary history. She explained to her audience that American cooking was created by immigrants who had brought recipes, tastes, and tools from the old world and applied them to new world ingredients. Things like cod, turkey, venison, lobster, corn, cranberries, wheat, and the like, which led to a distinctly American set of flavors and dishes. Now, this history was personally significant to Julia. Her father's family were Scotch Presbyterians, and her mother's family were Plymouth Colony settlers. They had made a fortune in the paper business before moving to the Midwest and eventually to California in a kind of classic American exodus. Yet the family connection to New England remained strong. Like her mother and sister, Julia graduated from Smith College in Northampton, and she was mindful that, quote, as Massachusetts is the mother of American cooking, so Boston is the mother of American cookbooks. Julia liked to point out that your state had a significant influence on the development of American cuisine, in part because the recipes developed here translated well to the Midwest and the West, unlike many of the recipes developed in the South, for example. In 1975, Julia and James Beard planned an ambitious book and television project about these roots of American cooking. It was called 13 Feasts for 13 Colonies. As usual, Julia did massive amounts of research, and her timing was uncanny. The next year, 1976, was the nation's bicentennial, and Julia used it to learn how her ancestors cooked and what they ate. She was excited to discover that our chowders originated with chaudières, the giant cauldrons used by French-Canadian fishermen. She learned that the Dutch brought coleslaw, pancakes, and donuts to New York. The Swedes brought meatballs to Delaware, and the Germans brought sauerkraut and scrapple to Pennsylvania. The English enjoyed giving their foods funny names, like toad in the hole, which was sausage and Yorkshire pudding, or spotted dick, which is suet and dried fruit pudding, and bubble and squeak, fried leftover vegetables. Being Julia, she couldn't wait to try dishes with names like soup in your pocket from Rhode Island, apple Jonathan from New York, pigeon stew and scripture cake from New Jersey, slump, buckle, and grunt from New Hampshire, and limping Susan and hopping John from North Carolina. And Julia didn't shy from the dark side of our culinary history, noting how dangerous fishing on the Grand Banks could be, as the widow's walks along the coast attest, or how the slave trade was fueled by cod, molasses, and rum. She and Jim Beard shot a pilot for this colonial food show at the Wayside Inn in Sudbury. Alas, it did not go well. While Beard stared down at his food and mumbled into his chest, Julia was effervescent and naughty, cracking jokes and winking into the camera. The chemistry between the two old friends, which was so good on stage, simply didn't work on air. And Julia allowed 13 Feasts to die a quiet death, though she would recycle much of her research later. Undeterred, Julia agreed to cover the 1976 bicentennial state dinner at the White House, hosted by President and Mrs. Ford for Queen Elizabeth and Prince Philip. Now, Julia had been to the White House once before, in 1967, when she covered a state dinner hosted by President Lyndon B. Johnson for the Prime Minister of Japan. Back then, Julia was the first person to bring television cameras into the White House kitchen. And as a former diplomatic wife, she understood the important role that food can play as a social and political lubricant. At the bicentennial, a vicious rainstorm rolled in at the last minute and nearly washed out the Ford's white tie party. And while LBJ had the suave Tony Bennett as entertainer in '67, Ford had invited the captain and Tennille to sing Muskrat Love in '76. Julia deemed that unqueenly. It was not a great event, but Julia went out of her way to hail the dinner, made from America's best ingredients and perfectly prepared by the Swiss-born, French-trained chef Henry Holler. The next day, Mimi Sheraton complained in the New York Times that, quote, one could not help wondering if a really imaginative, thoroughly American dinner might not have been more interesting and appropriate to the occasion than this menu, which was all-purpose international. Julia was incensed by what she considered this false argument. To make her point, she provided a translation of the White House menu in which a French quiche aux crevettes became an open-faced tart of Louisiana shrimp. An homard became a lobster from northern Maine, and a filet de boeuf was really just a prime tenderloin of Texas steer. Julia said, "It's a matter of packaging and public relations. All you have to do is change the names of the dishes from International French to National American, and everyone is happy." Julia emphasized this kind of culinary translation over her entire career. In the mid-1990s, she created an ambitious series of books and television shows with regional specialists. First, Cooking with Master Chefs, and then In Julia's Child's Kitchen with Master Chefs. She cooked with Emeril Lagasse and Leah Chase from New Orleans, Lydia Bastianich from Italy, Amy Ferguson Ota from Hawaii, Zarela Martinez from Mexico, and Madhur Jaffrey from India, and made dishes like Thai spring rolls, Spanish paella, and Sardinian bread. She deemed these foods contemporary American cooking, and her message was that other people's food is our food, and always has been. She won another Emmy for this work, and it sealed her legacy as a gifted and inclusive culinary diplomat. Julia described cooking as a civilized art, and she loved its creativity and camaraderie. "Let's all gather around the dinner table," she'd say. "That's what good cooking is all about." Thanks.
Okay. Well, I'm Stephen Chen. I'm Joyce Chen's youngest son. And my sister was supposed to be here today, but she's traveling, so you have me. Growing up with my mom was really kind of an interesting adventure. I was with her throughout the 50s, 60s, 70s, 90s. And let me give you just a little bit background of how she became interested in cooking. Because she really wasn't a chef, and she wasn't planning to be a chef. What happened was, when she was little, our family were diplomats, and one of her uncles was going to go to Russia, and he said that there wasn't any good Chinese food in Russia, and that if he could borrow my mother's family's chef to take with him so he could have good Chinese food in Russia. And my grandfather agreed, and that left my mother with the chef's wife. And her duty was to take care of my mother and also cook the dinners. So she spent her hours, what the cook did was keep my mother in the kitchen, watch my mother, and then cook. And this is where my mom's interest in cooking started. She would start making small little pastries, and eventually she would start, when she was a teenager, she would cook banquets and entertain the family, and something that she really loved. Then the war came, which of course changed everyone's life. And at that time, she lived in Shanghai. She was a very sociable person. She met students who were Chinese who actually went to Harvard and MIT. And when the opportunity came to the US, due to the communists coming into Shanghai in 1949, she took the last boat out of China. The advice was given to her by a relative who said, your husband is in a capitalist business, and it's really not appreciated to be in that business in China. You might as well go. And she felt that, well, she could always go, and she could always go back to China, or if she stayed in China, she'd probably be stuck. So she decided to go to China, and also she decided to go to Cambridge, because her friends who went to Harvard and MIT said, if you come to US, you have to come to Cambridge. And that's what she did. She was very insistent that we lived in Cambridge. And I wasn't born yet, but she actually lived on Kirkland Street, not too far where Julia lived. So she was just a housewife at that time. And then what happened was, we were going to school, a school called Buckingham in Cambridge, and they were having a school fair. And it all started with an egg roll. It's funny how these little things can happen. She worked all night, she made cookies, and she made egg rolls. and she brought them to the school fair. And she went back and to straighten up, and when she came to the school fair, she saw her cookies on the table, but her egg rolls weren't anywhere. And she was thinking, oh, maybe they didn't know what they were, or they hid them under the table. But as she got closer to the table, the mothers came up and said, Mrs. Chen, those egg rolls that you made, they sold out like hotcakes. Can you make more? She was so happy that she went back and made more. And then what also started was people asking, like, how do you make this? How do you do this? Because, Chinese food was kind of still chop suey chow mein at that time. When you went to a Chinese restaurant in the 50s, you were served French bread on the meal. And I remember when we opened our restaurant, some customers would come and say, what type of Chinese restaurant is this? You don't serve French bread. So, in the beginning, we actually did serve French bread. I have to admit. So this is our first restaurant on May 31st, 1958, grand opening. And it was on Concord Avenue. It was a old produce warehouse. And this is where, when I was 6 years old, they brought me to this building, and I said, this is a great place to play, not realizing that it was a Joyce Chen restaurant, which would really influence my life. And at this time, my mom was actually 41 years old when she opened the restaurant. She was very enterprising. She was a very driven person. But she also started teaching cooking at the Adult Education Center and also in Boston. And she loved cooking, and she would actually, in the beginning, she would even hold classes in our house, which was a small duplex. A tiny kitchen, but people would come and learn how to cook, and she put a sign that says, walk right in, and people would walk in. So she really kind of honed her skills about teaching cooking, and she really enjoyed it. And actually, there's a picture of myself with my date at the opening. And that girl there is, her father actually won the Nobel Prize in laser technology. It's interesting. The neighborhood that we lived on, we had a Nobel Prize winner and also a Secretary of Labor, it was really kind of a fun place to grow up. In 1958, we had our first menu. And at that time, when you ordered Chinese food and you went to Chinatown, it was kind of interesting because we don't speak Cantonese. And most of or Tai-Sanese, which most of the people in Chinatown. So when we went to Chinatown, to a restaurant, we couldn't communicate with them. So the writing was always the same. So my mom would write the order out, and she would even have to write the word rice, so they would serve us rice and give it to them, and they would cook. So what my mom said is, if we come out with a restaurant, we should have the Chinese, one menu, Chinese, and the English. And she did that. And you can see Peking ravioli, which we introduced back in 1958, was $1.20. You got 6 pieces. And a lot of people didn't know what these things were. And she named them Peking ravioli because of the strong Italian population here. Because she didn't want to call them dumplings, because dumplings in America are just kind of like noodles. So she wanted to show that these actually had some type of filling. So if you're in the Boston area, many of the restaurants still call it Peking ravioli. But if you go out of the Boston area, they're called dumplings or pot stickers. So that name actually held on, because when she had the restaurant, it's also interesting, because a lot of people don't realize that she was also a very good immigration lawyer. It was really hard to get chefs into America. And I think she actually applied over 30 chefs during her career, and who worked for us and who eventually opened their own restaurants. In 1962, she wrote her cookbook. She said that really she wanted to make it easy. And actually, if you look at the first edition, when it opens, the book actually stays open. And that's what, she was very inventive. She always liked these little things to do. So it was made so that when you turn to the page, the book would not fold up shut. She tried to get it published, but no one wanted to publish it. And some of the publishers said, Mrs. Chen, you want a color photo in a cookbook? There aren't any color photos in cookbooks. And she was really kind of ahead of her time. So what she did was actually she published the book herself and sold it at the restaurant and her friends. She was, she was able to go to a third printing, and eventually Lippincott took over the book, and also it was also published in Swedish. She also, through the restaurant, met a lot of interesting people. And the person who wrote the foreword for the cookbook was Paul Dudley White. He was the heart surgeon for Eisenhower at that time, and he also stressed on low-fat, exercise, low-sodium type of foods. And this is something that my mother also took at heart, is really eating healthy too. So later on, we didn't add any MSG, no artificial colors. This is back in the early 60s. Of course, then came in 1966 the cooking show. It was interesting because the set that my mom used was actually Julia's set. And of course, everyone knows Julia was a very tall woman, and my mother was not very tall. And they said, well, we can put her on a box to get the height right for her for cooking. But that was kind of strange because she would be up there and then she would step down and she'd be lower. So that didn't look really right. So they figured it out and they said, okay, what you need to do is you need to wear extra high heels. So this is her. She had to wear extra high heels in order to get the counter correct, the correct height. The other thing was, in those days, it was videotape, black and white, and there was actually no editing, so that when the shot was made, it was almost like live TV. And that's why some of those mistakes that you see were actually real mistakes, because they couldn't stop. They had to go on. So my mom and Julia had the same producer, Ruth Lockwood, and the same editor and the same camera people. And I remember in our home, Ruth Lockwood, the producer, would come over and just really time everything, really out to the minute with her stopwatch. Because when she started, the rice had to be ready at a certain time, the water had to boil at a certain time, and if there was a mistake, you just work right through it. So, but this is what really brought her into limelight, was the TV show. Also, my mom was also very inventive. She always, liked to invent things. So actually, she created and patented a flat bottom wok back in the 70s. And this is something that almost every home has, but I don't think a lot of people in America realize that it's credited through Joyce Chen's developing and marketing a flat bottom wok in America. So if you have one, it has some influence from Joyce Chen. And so she had the patent for the wok, and that actually is still being made today. And then, of course, in 1994, the U.S. Postal Service issued a series of celebrity stamps with Julia, James Beard, my mom, and that was a great honor for her. She died in 1994. In the mid-'80s, she came down with Alzheimer's. So that was really kind of a difficult time. But today, I tried to carry on her legacy by, still having her products out there in the supermarkets and, still being targeted towards being healthy and, lower sodium and things like that. But, I think she really felt that there was a need for people to learn Chinese cooking. It was, again, something she loved to share with people, and something that she, in the 50s and the 60s, kind of realized, that people should be cooking other foods. And, it's also, I think, important to us to realize that, immigrants to America are the ones who are really driving the innovation and the tastes of the world. And that's what America is all about. So, thank you.
We have time for a couple of questions? Okay. Any questions?
This question is for Mr. Chen.
Yes.
So what products does your mother still have out today that are available?
Well, she has her flat bottom wok, and there's a line of cookware, and then also we have like non-GMO sesame oil, pasta dipping sauces, the Peking raviolis are like at Market Basket and Wegmans. Low sodium soy sauce, which is organic. So it's something that I'm trying to kind of, even though it wasn't popular back in those days, but I think just as times came and with her philosophy about eating healthy, because my mom felt that in Chinese cooking, there were actually three features that you needed to have, and she added a fourth. So of course, first it had to taste good, had to smell good, and it had to have a good appearance, but her fourth one was it had to be healthy.
Thank you.
Thank you.
I'm not sure which panelist would be best suited to answer my question, but I wondered if somebody could comment on the availability of ingredients and how that shifted in the decades that you've been talking about. I know, as someone who grew up in the Midwest, that you could look at those recipes all you want, but there was no way you were going to get fresh bok choy in Ohio in 1960. So I'm wondering if somebody can talk a little bit about that transformation, really, of what you find in the supermarket.
There definitely was an ingredient issue. A lot of these things were more available in cities than people kind of remember or think of now. But you're right, if you're in a suburb or a small town in much of the country, you weren't going to get it. More and more things, however, were being shipped from California, and Julia loved this. She would go to the Star Market, as you know, her favorite place to go on Beacon Street, and she would rejoice over the arrival of the fresh asparagus and the things that were also, farm to table and so local now. We look at something from California and turn up our noses. To her, it was delicious, it was wonderful, and she welcomed it. But as Alex pointed out, it was Julia who had a huge impact on the availability of more things. Julia and the whole revolution that she helped to usher in. The more the stuff appeared in the cookbooks and in the newspaper recipes, then they started appearing. But there was that long, slow period through much of the country in the 50s where there was a lot of stuff you weren't going to get. Of course, you had access to wonderful fresh things that I think if they were available right next to you, maybe you thought it was just ordinary. But here in Massachusetts, we would have thought a tomato from one of your gardens in the Midwest was great.
Yeah, for my mom, it was like you were saying, like bean sprouts. I remember when she saw bean sprouts in the can, she was kind of horrified. So actually what she did was in her cookbook, she actually told you how to grow your own bean sprouts under your kitchen sink. But she also, based her recipes at that time on things that were available. Like if it was green beans, or she would substitute sometimes if you didn't have the bean sprouts, you would use shredded lettuce, iceberg lettuce, which was of course available at that time. But what I find now is just with more Asian immigrating to America, just more types of bok choy, baby bok choy, daikon, those things are more available. So, but she realized that, and even in our restaurant, we had beef and broccoli. Unfortunately, we had to use a regular broccoli, not a Chinese broccoli, but now you can get that in Chinatown. So, but she also told people to go shop in Chinatown. I remember going to Chinatown and a lot of people thanking her because she really kind of brought Chinatown in the mainstream to a lot of Americans and encouraged Americans to go into Chinatown and go to the markets and see the different foods. And I think she brought more awareness to the Chinese community and about the ingredients that were available. And also on her back of the book at that time, she actually had a tear-out sheet that had the name of the ingredients and also the name written in Chinese. So they could actually go to the market and say, you know, I want bok choy, and they would have the Chinese translation right next to it. So she kind of thought a lot about, you know, how people can get the proper ingredients.
I would add that what's interesting about that is that she's putting herself in the position of her readers, which is something that Julia did also. And not many cookbook authors in those days did. One of the things that Julia did was, in her first couple of cookbooks, Mastering the Art of French Cooking, Volume 1 and 2, she would have rather elaborate recipes, and she tried to tailor them for the American supermarket. But it was the American supermarket here in Boston, not in Ohio. And I think through feedback and just her own sixth sense, she realized that she was getting ahead of herself a little bit. And so in the 70s, she did a couple of cookbooks called Julia Child and Company, Julia Child and More Company, which were very different. They were big books physically, they were colorful, they had recipes that were sort of for the regular American cook. Excuse me. And she had, as with Joyce, she had a bunch of substitutes. So if you can't find X, then use Y. And Y goes really well with Z. And so she would have these sort of recipes that were kind of a series, that sort of variations on a theme is how she thought of it. And she always taught that if you could learn the technique, you could apply it to almost anything. And that's why she loved French food and French cooking, because there were these rules, which she loved to break, but she felt that you had to know the rules in order to break them, or to apply them in different ways. And so that was very empowering to people. And I think that emboldened people in Ohio and in Michigan and places where there was kind of a food desert in a sense, to experiment more and to have that confidence. And, you know, as Julia always said, you know, never apologize if you make a mistake, just keep trying. And that was really a powerful message to people. So you're totally right in your question. And it did take a while for the culture to catch up. But now you can go to a little supermarket in the middle of nowhere and get fresh mushrooms and bok choy and you know, just amazing stuff. Obviously Julia wasn't solely responsible for that, but she was one of the loudest voices pushing that revolution along.
This was a wonderful exposition of this period of the history of Boston's culinary traditions across a couple of different themes. I'm just wondering if you can, or if you have extrapolated to more recent influences where this period was about making culinary traditions accessible to everybody. And in the 80s and 90s in Boston, we see a blend of fine dining, some of the fusion of cultures emerging through the work of Barbara Lynch, Michael Schlau, Lydia Shire, and those that follow and those that are still cooking today. So I'm wondering if there's a way to join some of these dots back to that tradition that, in my opinion, starts about 20, 30 years ago.
Certainly, in terms of restaurants, one thing that Julia did was eagerly welcome and promote these adventurous chefs that were coming along after her. She was, as you know, amazingly not narcissistic. She really wanted to share the stage, and she saw this as a big cuisine was a big world, and the more people in it, the better. So she was a great encouraging person to a lot of these people coming along. And once you had somebody like that in your corner, especially in the rather small world that was Cambridge and Boston, you were definitely going to get a big leap forward. What's interesting to me is whether those restaurant foods, how they translate into home cooking. To some extent, people do get ideas from restaurants, but I think in Boston and Cambridge, a lot of it came bubbling out of cookbooks and the paper and the magazines, and then there would be shops, Sages, and then the well-stocked supermarkets where you could start getting stuff. So I think it was coming from the top down from restaurants, and then moving along on the ground level too, where people were really cooking at home.
I would add, that's absolutely true, and I would add to that that Cambridge was a very specific petri dish, that there were people from all over the world after the Second World War and brought with them their home cuisines. And so you could have borscht on one corner, you could have Chinese on the next corner, real Roman pasta. It was a very unusual place. And so that legacy, I think, continues today, and those chefs that you mentioned, many of them passed through the Harvest restaurant, for example, which was started by the Thompsons, who ran design research, and they lived around the corner from Paul and Julia Child, and there was this amazing community, and they all supported each other. Not only did they run design research and Harvest restaurant, which Paul and Julia would very kind of obviously go and patronize, which then helped people. They also were key in the redevelopment of Faneuil Hall. And so then Faneuil Hall became a model across the country for the Rouse Company to develop these giant kind of Leal type food markets. So you see a ripple effect that happens where it's very localized, but then the next thing you know, it's spreading all over the place. And I think that Julia herself, as Laura was saying, has this impact where she was very supportive of chefs of all ilks, although particularly, I think, and particularly if they were here in Boston, but people like Gordon Hammersley and Jasper White as well. Barbara Lynch is a perfect example. I interviewed her for my new book, and a lot of that got cut out, unfortunately, but she's a great character, and she's a wonderful cook, and she was kind of this scrappy street kid who got into cooking by kind of lying and conniving her way in there because it was a way out of the ghetto, in a sense, for her. And now she's probably Boston's leading restaurateur. And Julia mentored her and helped her and pushed her. It's really profound. I did an event with Barbara last October, and we was at her restaurant Menton, and she gave me this huge hug and almost burst into tears. And if you know her, that's pretty amazing because she's a tough cookie. So sometimes it does take one person, but I really think it was a cultural moment that was waiting to happen. I asked Julia, do you think this would have happened without you? And she said, oh yes, someone else would have come along. And I think that's probably true. However, she did have a specific genius. She was really good with people. She had this great charisma. She had this wonderful. She spent years sort of in France when nobody knew who she was, working and working and working. So she made it look easy, and she made it fun. And her big emphasis was less on nutrition and more on how delicious it was. And I think people could really relate to that.
Another really important factor of the last 20 and 30 years, of course, is that Boston and Cambridge have become high-tech major money centers too. And where there's money, there's room for restaurants. So when you have this sort of background of Julia and the chefs coming around, and then you add this influx of new money and people from all over the world coming here in the tech world, then you're going to get this very lively restaurant scene.
And more recently, you now have the farm-to-table movement, and there are all these farms not so far away. I mean, unlike where I live in New York City, where a farmer has to travel a couple of hours, farmers here, in half an hour, you can bring your stuff right off the farm right to the markets.
Yeah, I think what helped with my mom was that, Cambridge was very international. The other thing is that, with the universities, you always get new people all the time. Every 4 years, it's a new population, and they're looking for something new and different. And I think that, having these universities really kind of keep us alive and keeping us up to date. It was interesting, when the restaurant first opened, it was not doing that well. It was difficult. People didn't know what these dishes were. And we would have the regular Chinese professors and students who would be coming over. So again, my mom was pretty enterprising. So she said, well, why don't we do on our slow nights, Tuesday, Wednesday night was our slow nights, we'll do all-you-can-eat buffet. And it was, I think, like $7.99 all you can eat. So the first day, she started the buffet, and on the buffet table was a ham and a roast turkey. And she felt that if people didn't know the other type of Chinese food, they'll go for the ham and turkey. So, so my investment for the dinner is at least I get something that I know and I'm familiar with. And within just a few weeks, she was able to get rid of the ham and get rid of the turkey and put more authentic food on. And it just became so busy in those days. As a matter of fact, it became so busy that at that time, my mom and my father were working at the restaurant. They had music. My father would put a upbeat tempo music to make people go faster through the line. So, he was kind of, that was his idea. So I remember the music would go, da-da-da-da-da-da, and people would kind of go through the line. But, I think, again, it's just the, and of course, she brought in a lot of chefs too, which, created more Chinese restaurants. I think now, though, it's hard to find really a good Chinese restaurants because I think they're trying to be, they're trying to be Chinese, Thai, sushi, and they're not really specialized in what they're doing. And also, being in the grocery business, I also see more home replacement meals in supermarkets. Blue Apron, I think, has caused a big impact for people to kind of, we'll provide the ingredients, we'll provide you with the recipe, and here, you can cook this in your home. So I think that with the Food Network and the internet, where you can just, say, banana bread and get 50 recipes for banana bread, is just, is really kind of making people explore different possibilities.
One more question?
Yeah, thank you. All right. Well, this has been just a fabulous presentation, and for me, it's in a way nostalgic, because I grew up in the 50s with really all that canned food. It was terrible. A lot of tuna fish surprise, a lot of fish sticks, a lot of hot dogs and beans every Saturday night. So when Paul and I got married, and I got Julia Child's cookbooks for wedding presents, well, I didn't know how to cook. I started with the confidential chat, and I still make some of those recipes. I still have them. And then I started with Julia Child when I made beef bourguignon. We sat down to eat, and I said, this is beef stew.
Exactly.
I had no idea till I served it what it was.
Right.
Oh, but this is really interesting. So you were not a huge cook. You started that recipe, but you could follow her instructions
I
because
could.
she wrote them that way.
She did, and I still use those cookbooks. I think they're wonderful, and her other cookbooks, I have a lot of those too. So I just wanted to have a little nostalgia, but tell you all this has just been wonderful. Thank you.
Well, great way to end. Thank you.